I just wanted to acknowledge that wherever we are meeting tonight, that we're meeting on Aboriginal land, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. It always is and always has been Aboriginal land.
The proposal for Matraville is the fourth waste-to-energy incinerator under consideration around Sydney, with Cleanaway wanting to build one at Blacktown, Energy Australia looking at a plant in Lithgow, and Next Generation's Eastern Creek project was rejected, but that decision's being appealed. Though they could all be stopped, a bill will be introduced to state parliament to ban incinerators in urban areas.
Hi, my name's Kim Wright, resident of since 1989. I'd like everybody to understand that this doesn't just affect us. This affects all of Sydney. This is going to get into our air, into our water, into our soil. This is our future. Pollution, and it is going to cause death and disfigurement, all sorts of problems for our children.
I'm also an elder at St Mary's Presbyterian Church. Now, I can't speak on behalf of the church, but I can speak as a local Christian resident. This proposal has no merit whatsoever.
Now, my 4 boys and myself, we suffer with severe asthma, okay? Please help and put your hands together and fight this. We will win.
I think as a younger person, there isn't a lot of people that know about this. It's a New South Wales issue, it's an Australian issue, and you know, it's affecting our environment, bottom line. I'm an asthmatic too.
I'm extremely concerned, not just for myself, my husband, but I have a child.
Concerned over Public Health Association warnings that incinerators can emit harmful chemicals called dioxins.
Dioxins have been associated with a variety of cancers, but also associated with reproductive problems as well.
Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not there.
The incinerator doesn't have a social license. I have a condition that means I have to take a drug called methotrexate. Methotrexate means that your lungs are compromised. So dirty air means I'm compromised. I also have scoliosis, which means my ribs are very uneven and I have low lung capacity. So that combination means that I'm extremely vulnerable. What the people that are investing in that incinerator are saying is that someone else can pick up the problems that they are going to create. And that someone else is going to be the immediate family and then society. We cannot allow this to happen to individuals like me, to other people that have the potential to be hurt by this, and most importantly to the next generation. It's wrong.
Waste to energy, a climate scam. What is waste to energy? First and foremost, it's a trick. Decades ago, when the tide started turning against trash burning and coal and oil were getting a bad rap, trash burning companies rebranded themselves as waste to energy, claiming that they can renewably produce energy from waste. But burning trash is a climate disaster, emitting high levels of greenhouse gases alongside toxic pollution. Incinerators with names like gasification, pyrolysis, plasma arc, and waste to energy all emit harmful pollutants, despite industry claims that they are green technologies. Here are 6 myths around so-called waste to energy schemes that you should know about. Myth number 1. Burning waste produces clean, renewable energy. Fact. Waste is non-renewable. It's made up of stuff like paper, plastic, and glass that are derived from natural resources like forests that are being depleted at unsustainable rates. Myth number 2. Incinerators efficiently produce electricity and produce less climate pollution than alternatives. Fact. All incinerators are a massive waste of energy and release high levels of climate pollution. To produce the same amount of energy, incinerators release more carbon dioxide than coal-fired power plants. Myth number 3. Modern incinerators have pollution control devices such as filters and scrubbers that make them safer for communities. Fact. Even the most technologically advanced incinerators release pollutants that contaminate our air, soil, water, food supply, and bodies. Myth number 4. Incinerators are compatible with recycling. Fact. Incinerators rely on burning many valuable resources that can be recycled and composted, and incinerators compete for the same materials as recycling programs. Myth number 5. Incinerators are an affordable option and provide jobs for communities. Fact. Incinerators are the most expensive method to generate energy and to handle waste, and offer few jobs when compared to recycling. Myth number 6. Incineration helps keep plastic out of our oceans. Fact. You can't disappear plastics through incineration. You can only turn the plastics into pollution which settles in our air and our oceans. Overwhelming evidence shows that incinerators negatively impact public health, local economies, the climate, and the environment. But here's the good news. We can get rid of this dirty and polluting practice, and hundreds of cities and communities around the world already are. They're opting instead for zero waste. Zero waste means reducing what we trash in landfills and incinerators to zero. Zero waste systems involve recycling, composting, reuse, redesigning poorly made products, sharing with neighbors, and reducing the amount of stuff we produce and consume. Zero waste systems create jobs, far more than landfills or incinerators, and protect health, justice, and the climate. For example, in the Spanish province of Gipuzkoa, an anti-incineration movement led to the adoption of zero waste principles in several small cities and has reduced the amount of waste being dumped or burned by 80%. In Pune, India, a door-to-door collection service operated by grassroots recyclers diverts enough waste to avoid 640,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually, while waste picker incomes have more than doubled. These are just two examples. Thousands of grassroots groups and citizens around the world have been battling and defeating incinerators and implementing zero waste systems. Let's not let polluting incineration schemes undermine these beautiful solutions.
In Australia, we don't have the heating capacity. We don't have central heating, district heating, or even district cooling or anything like that. Does that mean it's less efficient for Australia to invest in waste to energy, for instance?
Absolutely, that is the case. Unfortunately, if you only use the electricity, of course, the energy efficiency in the plant will be much lower than what you can find in Sweden and in other parts of the world where you also have district heating. So that will make the whole calculation less efficient.
So it is clear that in the future we're going to see incinerators closing down in Europe because they're going to have less and less waste to burn, and recycling is going to go up.
Other countries that have gone the other way have kind of invested in increasing the recycling rather than waste to energy, for instance.
Yeah, we have examples in Europe where we are seeing cities actually being a lot more advanced than Copenhagen, with a lot less investment, get a lot further. Like, for example, Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia, 500,000 people, they don't have an incinerator. They are recycling in the order of 65%, which is like more than twice as much as Copenhagen, with a lot less investment, and they're recycling a lot more.
What is the effect in terms of emissions of burning plastics?
Well, you get CO2 emissions, you get carbon dioxide emissions, like if you incinerate oil.
I can't believe I'm saying this because I think we come from Australia where most things are buried, and I hate the idea of landfill. But is it sometimes worse to be burning plastics than actually burying them?
Yes, it can be, at least in the short term, because if you incinerate plastics, you get the carbon dioxide emissions immediately, whereas if you bury them, it will take a long time before they degrade.
Pose a public health risk. Tiny nanoparticles can, in fact, nestle themselves in our bodies with a single breath. The question is, how long do they stay there? A UK study suggests that the long-term accumulation of nanoparticles in the vital organs of rats warrants a closer look at the bodily effects of nanomaterials. Most animal studies have shown that breathable nanoparticles that are lodged in the lungs are typically cleared within a few months, with fewer than 1% traveling to other organs, such as the brain, liver, or kidneys. But what happens to these particles long-term? To answer this, the UK researchers tracked iridium particles inhaled by rats for over 3 months. During the first week, their results seemed to agree with those reported in other studies. A small fraction of particles accumulated in the kidneys and liver. But in the liver, they appeared to pile up indefinitely. And what's more, the particles were cleared much more slowly from the lungs than previously observed. Together, these findings suggest that continuous exposure to nanoparticles could present a long-term toxicity risk.
Cleanaway's proposed incinerator at Eastern Creek would be only 1 kilometre away from childcare centre, 2.9 kilometres away from Horsley Park Public School, 1.7 kilometres away from our drinking water, 1 kilometre away from family homes. The next generation's proposal at Eastern Creek would only be 800 metres away from a childcare centre, 1.8 kilometres away from 3 schools, 5 kilometres away from our drinking water, and 800 metres from family homes. So it's very concerning to think that those nanoparticles and dioxins and everything is going to be, going around in the air in such close proximity to our children at school and, preschool children.
Good evening, my name is Taylor Clarke. I'm a proud Gundungurra, Darug and Wiradjuri woman. Before I do begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respects to Aboriginal people with us tonight. Here in this space and in my work, I represent the voices of my elders and of the ancestors who protected country for thousands of years. I work with my elders throughout the Western Sydney community, providing advice to and lobbying local and state governments on issues of Aboriginal culture and heritage. Obviously, we're opposed to this proposal, and I echo the sentiments of my colleagues here today. This is an issue we all have a stake in. The Sydney Basin provides the perfect environment for the toxic ash and pollution to become trapped. And as some of you have spoken about, but as I've realised, there are 2 types of ash, bottom ash and fly ash. Fly ash contains high levels of heavy metals, and for this reason, it is classed as a hazardous waste. It generally makes up 15 to 25% of the original quantity of the waste burned. And this ash has to be disposed of in landfill and then can pollute underground aquifers and surrounding areas. And we know that when the land gets sick, we all get sick. A waste-to-energy incinerator does not solve any problems, and what we can see here is that many will become complacent with what is already very wasteful consumerism. Rather than investing in an expensive waste-to-energy incinerator, the government should be investing more into the effort to reduce our current waste stream, reusing and recycling more discarded materials. In my job, it does feel as though we are constantly fighting proposals like this, and every time one gets knocked back, 3 more comes up, and I'm sure many of you know what that feels like. It is very frustrating, and unfortunately, it feels like this work will never be done, but I would like to commend all of you for being here today.
But when it comes to incinerators, why am I and the environment group completely opposed to it? It comes down firstly to air quality. Like, when it comes to human rights, clean air, good water, and good land, and then sustainable food from that is what we should all expect. Given that, we end up right now, particularly with air quality in Western Sydney, constantly adding things that are creating more and more particulates and more carcinogenic accumulators, bioaccumulators into our environment. And I'll just share with you, MAC stands for Metropolitan Air Quality Study, and they did a study of the air quality of Sydney. And they determined that particulates, even from the lower Hunter and upper Central Coast coal mines, ended up coming into the Sydney air basin. And the Sydney air basin air basically swirls. It's cyclonic, with the vortex or the centre of the swirl being between St Mary's and Badgerys Creek. So air comes into the Sydney air basin and swings around and ends up basically concentrating in Western Sydney. The original air summary and modelling, which was done for the next generation incinerator, was based on a certain model set. And this model set's been changed. And a expert in air quality, they said, called Alex Tortorowski, who's their consultant and is ex-New South Wales EPA, explained that they've changed the air quality modelling. And in doing that, I do believe that alone will have a detrimental effect on understanding that the air quality in Western Sydney accumulates and doesn't have because past Parramatta, we don't get a coastal breeze and a refresh that they do on the eastern side of Sydney. So I think that it's very important to understand that when it comes to air quality, Western Sydney has a major issue. And if I go back to my shared screen again, the part of it is to those what they call POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. The second paper below it shows that it accumulates in chicken eggs. And this is a peer-reviewed paper. It shows that in the Balkans, bioaccumulates in the wildlife, which would happen in people as well. Obviously, birds per se have shorter lifespans and turnovers, and in that instance, they would bioaccumulate in that. And to Melinda's documentary, that accumulation ends up often in the kidneys and all that. So, to me, from a health perspective, and it's for humans, but it's also for the fauna and the avian life that we have in our area, we will have a lot more detrimental effect to our native wildlife. I have a major issue about the resilience and the level of what would I say? It's their control and having public confidence in the current situation from the New South Wales EPA. Number one, their regulation. There is the New South Wales regulation on air quality is very poor compared to Europe, and there's no focus on carcinogens, particularly down at the PM 2.5 or the PM 1 levels, which is very important. I believe that monitoring should be live, transparent, independent, and 24/7. So I would imagine that whatever we can should be live, able to be seen by all citizens from an independent monitoring station in Eastern Creek area. Because in the end, they say we've got 4 monitoring stations nearby, but it really comes down to, in Western Sydney, how close these issues are to us. I am personally 3 kilometres from the Cleanaway incinerator and 7.5 kilometres from the next generation incinerator, as a crow flies. And so to me, just in where I live and as a resident, it's going to be affecting me personally. I think that from the Blacktown District Environment Group, we all believe, and the group's been going for 25 years, that this is just creating a state of unhealth for Western Sydney. Thank you.
Hi everybody. It's so great to see so many people coming together tonight to talk about this issue and to think about ways we can stop these horrendous incinerators from going ahead. Just to be very clear from the outset, the Greens believe these incinerators are a bad idea. We've always thought they're a bad idea. We introduced a bill back in 2018, the bill to essentially ban them from within 15 kilometres of a residential area. We still think they're a bad idea, and we stand with the community in your fight against them. We know that the community's already rejected the waste to energy incinerator. We've already rejected it once, but also not just the community, but of course the Eastern Creek proposal has been rejected by a parliamentary inquiry, been rejected by the EPA, by New South Wales Health, by the Departments of Environment and Planning, by local councils, the Independent Planning Commission. I can't see how these 4 incinerators now are so different to suddenly be okay by all of those bodies and the community less than 2 years later. So in fact, you would think, given the growing climate crisis, given the kind of global health crisis that we're now seeing, particularly in relation to people with respiratory conditions, you would think that these types of incinerators are in fact, or should be, blacklisted. So we're very keen to work with the community and see how we can help coordinate resources, efforts across the various communities that are working on this, recognising we have members in all parts of the state that are interested in working on this campaign. The big thing, I mean, we've heard a lot of issues tonight already in terms of why this is such a serious issue to stop. For a big one for me personally, I've got the environment portfolio. In fact, I've also got the health portfolio for the Greens. A really big one is the way that these incinerators are kind of floated as this, they're kind of floated as a green solution, if you like, both to the energy crisis, climate crisis, as well as to the waste crisis. Of course, they do neither. And in fact, they're a lazy solution to the waste crisis. That's kind of putting it down nicely, actually. They, in fact, could make it a lot worse. We know that, like the Greens, for example, have a circular economy policy. We have a zero waste policy, yet this completely throws all of that out of the water. Of course, it encourages waste as a fuel resource. We know that encourages consumption, it encourages the production of waste. Yes, we have a waste crisis, but our governments, both at the state level and the federal level, have been so lazy in terms of dealing with the waste crisis. They could, for example, here in New South Wales, invest all of the waste levy, which is something like $1.6 billion a year that the New South Wales government gets for all the waste that's dumped into landfill. They could invest all of it into waste solutions, recycling solutions, reducing waste, looking at extended producer responsibility. They could do that, but no, we only have, I think, 16% of that levy goes into waste solutions and the rest goes into general Treasury revenue. That is crazy. That's why we're not on top of our waste situation here in New South Wales. It's partly, and of course, because of the contamination issues with China. But it's our problem. We have to reduce it. We have to look at zero waste. We have to do that circular economy stuff. And this will absolutely send us backwards. Not to mention the fact that a lot of the waste that is going in is of course plastics. People have talked about that. Plastics is, we know where it comes from. It comes from largely oils. We have companies that are reliant on burning plastics. We're not going to reduce our plastic production or consumption, and that is a complete nightmare. We have to. We know that Sweden, for example, people say, oh, the waste incinerators are happening in Europe and Sweden does these fantastic things. Well, of course, we know that now Sweden is importing waste because for these incinerators, they've actually managed to reduce waste, but they're still needing waste because they're reliant now on these incinerators in terms of waste to energy. From a health spokesperson, I won't cover all the issues because I know everybody will tonight. From a health spokesperson perspective, it is a complete disaster. One thing in relation to where the New South Wales government stands. So you'll hear them talking about pollution standards and, oh, it's okay that these incinerators will fit within the standards, pollutant standards of we'll regulate them. Well, that's the problem here in New South Wales because we regulate things so poorly. Our coal-fired power stations are so poorly regulated. We have a standard for sulfur dioxide coming out of our coal-fired power stations that's 11 times higher than the World Health Organization recommends. And the World Health Organization's recommendations aren't always the toughest in relation to this. And the Australian government now wants to look at regulations for coal-fired power stations for sulfur dioxide that is still 2.5 times weaker than what the World Health Organization recommends. So don't trust these kind of standards that the New South Wales government we don't know, because they are desperate to deal with this piling up waste crisis in a way that's easier for them and that industry is begging them to, or at least parts of industry. And they will talk about standards rubbish. And remember that standards in relation to EPA aren't about limiting to the absolute minimum. They're about regulating industry, allowing industry to pollute. That's their job. The community doesn't want these. Why build them?
The EPA is very clear around waste to energy, a really big requirement. One of the two key requirements is that the community acceptance must be there, must be obtained.
I was mayor of Blacktown for 5 years, and all 5 years I had to, with council and local community, and thanks to everyone that's been involved, we all live close by. I'm a little bit further in the Mighty Dooney area, but still we know the impacts it's going to have on our area. But you know, I went overseas to check out some of these facilities. I spoke to protest groups over there, as well as the lobbyists there. And it's quite clear that this is old and outdated and probably 20th century technology. For me, everything that you burn means that there's less going into the circular economy or trying to save in the waste. Just very briefly looking through a couple of points that we need to look at is one is setting the recycling targets and the enforceability and supporting it. Really the standards across the world, people refer to the EU standards, it's one of the best in the world, but I've got to say, you look at any of the incineration technologies being built, most of them are coming in at 10% of the emissions that the EU is even saying. So all the standards across the world are out of date, and the ones in New South Wales are like 30 to 40 years out of date. The only solution is a parliamentary solution. The bill that we put up, the Labor put up through the lower house, was just calling for a moratorium. What is the planning process? What's the environmental standards? What is the what's the recycling rates that we need? But I think what we need to do is come up with a bill that just broadly says, let's put a moratorium at the moment until we get the laws right and the regulations right. Because currently the regulations and everything is about, you know, is about 30 years old.
I'm Jonothan Moylan. I'm a clean air and energy and climate campaigner at Greenpeace. Greenpeace is obviously an independent organisation, and it's really great to see the opposition across the spectrum to rubbish burning. Incineration is obviously the worst way to deal with waste, and others have talked about the impacts of dioxins, of furans, mercury emissions, fine and ultrafine and nanoparticles ranging from a 30th to 1,000th the width of a human hair. They can lodge in the lungs, sneak past the body's defence systems, and of course huge impacts on the climate as well at a time when we're facing a global climate crisis. We are particularly concerned about the health impacts of incineration. Air pollution is already a major issue in Australia that leads to about 3 times more deaths than the annual road toll. And Sydney in particular, as an ear-shaped basin, really traps air pollution, particularly under certain meteorological conditions. When you get an anticyclonic event off the coast of Sydney, you get air rushing up the Parramatta River and the Georges River and trapping up there. And when you get an inversion like the horrific days that we saw at the start of the year, I think it was pretty obvious. I was out in Seven Hills. It was difficult to breathe. But even without catastrophic and unprecedented bushfires, there is already a major problem. It's also associated with high rates of asthma hospitalisation in children. This isn't anything that governments haven't known. We've known since I think about 2004, when the what's now called the National Environment Protection Council looked at the sort of background levels of air pollution all across the country, and they found that there are already there's already heightened risk of asthma hospitalisation in children from levels of air pollution that we frequently face in major cities. It's already been mentioned, obviously, the air pollution standards that we have are weak, 10 times worse than the World Health Organization guidelines. The World Health Organization is actually looking this year at revising downwards their standards for a number of different pollutants, and that's because of the increasing weight of evidence, including from the head of medicine at the University of Sydney in a groundbreaking study that was published in The Lancet, led from Australia, that showed that air pollution at half of the World Health Organization guidelines causes heart attacks. So in the context of that, putting 4 additional incinerators in the Sydney Basin is ridiculous. It's a bin fire of an idea. It's toxic, it's dangerous, it's harmful to the climate, and the community doesn't want it. And we can have a different kind of energy future. And it's the efforts of groups like Western Sydney Direct Action, like this real network of anti-incineration groups right across the city, and the growing movement. I think there's more people on the call now than when we started an hour ago, of people who know that waste incineration is not a problem, is not a solution to energy. It's certainly harmful to the climate, and it puts the lungs of young people, and people most particularly exposed to the harms of air pollution, at risk. So I want to encourage you, keep doing what you're doing. To all those across the political spectrum who are sane enough to understand that burning rubbish is a dumb idea, keep up the efforts, and particularly in Parliament. Obviously, the one notable absence I think we have here is from the New South Wales government themselves. We definitely need a ban on incineration right across New South Wales.
I guess from my background, I spent a lot of my time in the chemical industry working with intractable chlorinated material, and I got involved with the Matraville campaign because I didn't want to see that area repolluted with chlorinateds. We currently have a major aquifer that runs from Centennial Park to Botany Bay, which is badly polluted with chlorinated pollutants, and is being diverted by Orica Australia, and that will have to happen for the next 30 or 40 years. I don't believe there's really any point arguing about not wanting toxic smoke. I think that really what we've found sewers are saying to us is that nothing to see here. Our levels, as you can see, are quite low, but what they're not telling you is that they're quoting steady state running figures. So I think you need to focus on start up, shut down, and bypass events where the filtration system is actually bypassed. Because when that happens, there could be very serious emissions going straight up the stack.
The Colong Foundation got involved in this issue earlier this year. It had been involved somewhat in the past, but it got more involved this year when the Mount Piper Energy Recovery Project, EIS, was put on public exhibition. This was the project by Energy Australia and Regroup referred to earlier, I believe. I'm representing a number of conservation groups through the Garns Stone Alliance who oppose this project. That includes Blue Mountains Conservation Society and the Lithgow Environment Group as well. So just a bit of context, as everyone knows, these projects are no good for the local communities. The Lithgow region and Blue Mountains townships will certainly suffer as a result of this project in Lithgow. Lithgow LGA already actually experiences quite high levels of morbidity due to respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, which these conditions will certainly be worsened by the presence of an incinerator in the region due to the particulates that it would generate. Similarly, the prevailing winds for the site actually blow west to east over the year, so that will push the toxic plumes across the Blue Mountains communities and also through the World Heritage Area. So the proposed position of the incinerator is certainly reckless. It's especially in regard to environmental impacts due to that positioning, given that it really sits basically on the boundaries of the hugely biodiverse Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, and also the proposed Garns Stone state conservation area that our group is working to reserve. The position of the toxic ash dump site for the energy recovery incinerator will also be adjacent to the headwaters of the Cox's River, which feeds into the Sydney water catchment supply. The proposed emplacement is too small for where it sits. It's located on hollow ground on a site which is underlaid by old coal mine workings. This ground is really quite a lot more likely to connect to groundwater, and this has actually already occurred at Mount Piper. So we've seen leaching from these dumps into the groundwater, leading to, in this case, high salinity, but in the case of the refuse, the ash from the ERP would be far more toxic.
We have particular concerns about the climate impacts of these incinerators. An argument is used sometimes that this will reduce methane emissions from landfill, and that is an argument which can be easily refuted by the circular economy zero waste solution, which is a far better solution to transporting or having fossil fuel using vehicles transporting waste long distances to dumps, or is one of the arguments for building an incinerator. But the incinerator certainly isn't a clean energy option. It produces nitrous oxides, and at about 3 times the rate per unit of energy the coal-fired power station does. But it's a lot worse than that in terms of climate impact, because nitrous oxides are about 300 times more damaging than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas over a 20-year timeframe period. So that's a very significant impact. Another great concern is the fly ash that's produced, the toxic fly ash. And it's something I'd like to examine a bit more, because fly ash is extensively used in concrete, which is another major emitter. Cement, the binder in concrete, is a major problem in terms of greenhouse gas emissions as well, in terms of production of cement. But the use of that fly ash in the concrete is also problematic, and I think we need to much more closely examine the radioactive relationship of fly ash continuing to be used in concrete and the concrete production itself. So that's one perspective I'm certainly concerned about. I'm also involved with a group called Better Planning Network, and Better Planning Network's very concerned about the lip service that is being paid by Malouf in his Supreme Court challenge to the normal processes, where clearly the communities in Western Sydney don't want incinerators. Clearly the ones in Matraville or Lithgow don't want it. They should have priority in any ecologically sustainable development type principles, and intergenerational equity. There are enormous issues here that are being defied basically in terms of Malouf's claims into the Supreme Court. So hopefully that will be a failure, but you can never tell with the political system or the judicial system sometimes. So there are a couple of my major concerns there. Better Planning Network will, I'm sure, take this battle up. I also took it to the City of Parramatta Council as a councillor that I've been since 2017, quite early in that term, and it's a very conservative composition of councillors, but all councillors, including 5 Liberals, 3 Conservative Independents, 5 Labor, and me as a Green councillor, strongly opposed, in fact, the incinerator at Eastern Creek, even though we're not immediately close to it, but we're close enough to still suffer a lot from the toxic pollution and fallouts, as others have already mentioned. So I believe we can continue to fight this matter at the local government level as well, and we must fight it. To have a toxic incinerator in the middle of metropolitan residential Sydney, so close to our water supply and national heritage Blue Mountains national parks is just crazy in my view.
So my name is Mike Ewald. I'm the founder and director of Energy Justice Network. We're a national network based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we're mostly active in the US, but sometimes helping people all around the world. And I'm glad to be here and helping you all with this. We've worked with folks in Australia on poultry waste incinerators in the past on both coasts, and hope to see those also go nowhere. So most of what we do is we help people fight off dirty energy and waste facilities with a heavy focus on incineration. So this here is just a window of about 5 years of victories of groups in our network that stopped biomass and waste incinerators. I like the fact that there's so many that you can barely read it. There's a strong history of communities stopping these sorts of things, so you should be encouraged about that in your own country as well. And it's a very deeply unpopular technology, and it's relatively easy to stop compared to some other industries. Now here's where you can find some more information. We have a lot of resources on this page, energyjustice.net/incineration. So this here is a trend line I made of the number of operating trash incinerators, commercial scale ones in the US. You see there were almost 200 in around 1991, it peaked. There are now 72 and the numbers keep falling. One encouraging thing is that even though they've tried hundreds of times to build new incinerators in the past few decades, they've only managed to build a new one at a new site in the US 25 years ago. There are some that have been expanded. There's one where they built a new one right next to an existing one in Florida. But other than that, there are no new ones other than some that have been expanded or rebuilt at an existing site in that time. Now, when I researched it recently, I found that in the past 2 decades, there were 30 trash incinerators that closed in the US, and their average lifetime was just 22 years old. And I've been using this to point out, as we have a lot of aging incinerators in the US that are starting to hit their 30-some year lifespan, and municipal governments seem to think they're going to last many years longer, and the companies tell them so, but that's not realistic, and we're seeing them shut down much earlier because they're just not cost effective or running into operational problems and maintenance issues. There are a lot of names used for incinerators. They know incinerator is a bad word. They even have called it the I word in their public or in their trade association meetings that I'll sometimes attend. So they use a lot of public relations terms like waste to energy. Covanta now prefers energy from waste. They have a lot of other terms and different types of incinerators as well, like pyrolysis, gasification, and plasma arc, which they'll insist are not incinerators. So there's just a lot of buzzwords to look for as well. One of the older ones, they used to call it trash to steam. That's literally impossible. So it's not just ice cubes in our trash cans turning into water vapor. It's trash to toxic ash and toxic air emissions. And it's not waste to energy either. We like to snarkily call it waste of energy in response because it actually saves 3 to 5 times as much energy if you recycle and compost those same materials than if you just burn them and waste them. And of course, and I point out on our website that you cannot literally turn waste into energy. We're not violating the laws of physics here. So you're literally just turning waste into toxic ash and air emissions, but no matter is being converted into energy in a literal sense. So I encourage journalists to be objective and not repeat the public relations terms like this. The largest waste company in the world, Waste Management, 6 years ago moved away from incineration, sold off their subdivisions that are involved in it, although they are still trying to pelletize trash and market it to burn in cement kilns, which is still incineration. So we're not totally out of the woods with them yet. This is what that looks like when they turn it into pellets. So look out for this. If you do defeat the incinerators you're working on, you might find that they're just going to move to this and try to convert it into fuel that they can market to coal plants or other burners. And some of the emerging threats, refuse by fuels, what I just described, are also waste to fuel schemes where they tried to turn waste into liquid fuels or chemicals. They're very incinerator-like, and we've been fighting those as well. Even anaerobic digestion, which could make sense in some contexts and should be used before landfilling trash, is not appropriate if we're going to use it to try to then pretend that the resulting product is fertilizer or should be burned in an incinerator. Now, I've made the claim that incineration is the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. I'm going to walk you through some slides on that really quickly. This is information from the National Trade Association in the US showing that incineration is more expensive than landfilling. We have a few other emissions from the industry on that as well. From the federal government, we see that trash incineration is also the most expensive way to make energy, even though unlike fossil fuel plants or nuclear plants where they pay to get a fuel, trash incinerators get paid to take what's essentially their fuel, but that's the difference between a fuel and a waste is who pays who. And even though that's the case, they get paid to take it, they're still the most expensive to operate and maintain of any energy source because the pollution controls cost so much. And we find that in the one state in the US that has elevated trash incineration to be equivalent to wind power in its renewable energy mandate, in 2011, we saw the value of those credits skyrocket, and that helped prop up the industry because the industry can't compete with wind, solar, and natural gas, which are still rather cheap. And so they keep finding ways to brand themselves as renewable and get different subsidies. Now, the old thought, and I saw this in one of your videos, is that incineration competes with recycling. And we used to think that because you would think they want the things that burn well, like paper and plastics. But in fact, we're learning more recently, probably because there's so much more plastic in the waste stream, that they're hitting their limit on how much they can burn. The boilers are rated at a certain amount of BTUs per hour, and so they actually can't feed waste anymore if they have too much plastic. So we're starting to see incinerators say, we love plastic recycling, but quietly what they're not saying is, although they admitted this on a tour to me once, one of them, that they compete more with composting. They want the wetter stuff that doesn't burn as well so they can feed more tons through and get paid per ton. We also know that their contracts almost entirely have put or pay clauses in them. They don't use those words in the contracts, they'll use other words, but it means that if you don't give them enough waste from your local government, you have to pay them anyway as if you did, which punishes zero waste efforts in the process. On jobs, we know they're the worst way to create jobs. They're about one job for 10,000 tons of material processed per year. You get about 10 times that with recycling and many times more with reuse. And I saw in one of your videos, you used the data I put together on this. This is a national comparison we did in the US of trash incinerators to coal plants. We found they're much dirtier on every measure. We started to do a new comparison. We have newer data on that. And if you bug me enough, I might finish the research work on that. I haven't finished it yet. It's a lot of number crunching, but we'll have many more pollutants to compare once we finish that. On global warming, we find they're 2.5 times as bad as coal, although they have a lot of gymnastics that they do with the numbers to make it seem like they're a climate solution, which I can walk you through at other times, but too much to get into right now. Dioxins you brought up. Dioxins are the most toxic chemicals known to science. They're literally 140,000 times more toxic than mercury. They cause all sorts of problems, and 93% of our exposure to them is through eating meat and dairy products. They travel extremely far. On that study I referred to in the chat is one from the US where they show that the highest contributors of dioxin to 8 sites in the Canadian Arctic were 2 trash incinerators in the US. And so it goes through this process of global distillation where it ends up traveling to the poles, but in the meantime ends up passing through all kinds of farm fields, contaminating them, and you end up with huge concentrations in meat and dairy because it loves fat and hates water and climbs the food chain very rapidly. This chart from EPA shows where you get your dioxin from. This chart alone is what made me go from vegetarian to vegan once I realized how much of it is in the dairy and milk supply as well. So one story that you'll hear from the industry with anything with a smokestack is they'll say, don't worry, we have continuous emissions monitors and we know what's coming out of our smokestack at all times. And the state will have this information and they'll fine us very heavily if we go over the limits. So of course we'll be within those limits. And those limits mean it's healthy and safe. And every part of that is a lie or misleading at least. I want to break that down really quickly. First, the emissions limits are not based on health and safety. They're technology-based standards based on what that technology can meet. They're also concentration-based, so you can have a 500 ton per day incinerator and a 3,000 ton per day incinerator, and the larger one will be allowed to emit 6 times more pollution because it's 6 times larger. It's also true that fines are not enough to deter behavior. So when they do get fined by an agency, that's not nearly enough to convince the company to install stricter pollution control so they don't go over a limit again. They'll just pay the fine as the cost of doing business and continue. But the biggest place where the emperor wears no clothes is if you ask them the question, what pollutants are you continuously monitoring? And you'll find out that there are about 3 pollutants that they continuously monitor, and the rest of them once a year or not at all. And I analogize this to if we let motorists drive around all year with no speedometer, and once a year we set a speed trap, and on the highways we have a signs that say, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And then the brother of the driver is running the speed trap because the companies do their own testing. So we see that there are about 3 pollutants that they continuously monitor, but the technology exists for about 50 or so different pollutants to be monitored in that way. And so we've started to pass local laws in certain states that allow it in the US that require additional pollutants, as many as 20 pollutants, to be continuously monitored, and require that they put that data on a public website for the world to see. And then we crank up the requirements to the strictest standards we can on a few pollutants so that it dissuades companies from building. And so far, this has been successful at stopping facilities anywhere that we've passed such a law. Now, the ash, for every 100 tons of trash burned, you get about 70 tons of it becoming the air pollution. And the other 30 tons become highly toxic ash, which go to landfills. If they don't send it to a landfill, they're doing something much worse with it. But the image of coffee beans on here is to make the analogy, if you pour water over coffee beans, you won't get coffee, right? But if you grind them up and increase the surface area, you pour water over them, you get coffee. Same thing with ash in a landfill. You're not doing a favor to landfill communities to send them a smaller amount of highly toxic concentrated ash that rainwater can leach toxins out of more readily. It's better to send them unburned trash and get the organics out of that so the landfill is not gassy and stinky in the first place, and avoiding all the air pollution of incineration. Let me skip that one. So incinerators compared to landfills. It's not one versus the other, it's it's landfills versus both, because you have to have a landfill for the ash, or versus zero waste and minimal landfilling. We did a life cycle assessment study of this very thing, and we found that incineration is indeed worse than landfilling. We looked at 10 different criteria. There are also 4 others that were done in separate analyses on economics. Of the 10 criteria we looked at, we found that incineration is worse than landfilling on 6 of them, about equal on another, and on 3 of the smallest measures, landfills are worse because incinerators don't emit certain pollutants like ozone depleters. When you take all that and put it together, you see all the biggest factors from global warming, toxic emissions, the asthma-causing nitrogen oxides, a lot of different pollutants. Incineration is definitely worse than landfilling, even if you have to ship the waste 4 times as far to a landfill, and probably much further than that. This statement would also be true, but that was our comparison. When we add them all up and monetize them so we can have one score, we found that incineration was about twice as bad as landfilling, all combined. And in the same region, we've been dealing with increasing fires at incinerators, and we saw that the industry is blaming lithium-ion batteries, but their waste piles have been catching fire. This one incinerator near Washington, D.C. caught fire and shut down the plant for almost a year because of all the damage that fire did, with about 3 stories of trash burning uncontrolled for 2 weeks. And in response to another one about an hour away, that also had a trash pile fire burn for almost 2 weeks, they came out with this and showed that over half of their plants had fires that required off-site emergency response just in the previous 5 years. And this is according to the largest company in the industry in the US. When I looked at the health studies on this, I found that there are a lot of different types of cancers that are elevated, respiratory diseases, and other diseases that studies show are elevated in communities around incinerators. It's very hard to find this. A lot of studies also say they didn't find anything, but the fact that some have show that there's a serious problem, because it's very hard to make a connection when the pollution travels so far, when people move around. There are a lot of ways to do these studies that make it really hard to find things, but several of them have found connections like this. And on solutions really quickly, let's walk through a bit on that. Zero waste is defined internationally. I helped to craft these definitions with the Zero Waste International Alliance, and it makes it clear in the newest definition that incineration is unacceptable, period, and that we're trying to avoid landfills as much as possible. This literally means zero incineration and at least 90% diversion from landfills. The idea of zero is not to be unrealistic, but just like we have zero drug tolerance, zero safety defects, and other kinds of policies, no boss says our goal is to injure 10 workers a year, right? That would be left out of the room. But with waste, we do that all the time and say, well, how much waste are you for? We're going to only recycle 35%. We need a goal that says we're going to try until we can't try anymore to get as close to zero as we can. So there are a number of policies that get you there. I won't get into that right now. This here is the zero waste hierarchy that I developed, which is now used as an international standard for what zero waste means and zero waste business certification. It's on our website as well as the Zero Waste International Alliance website with the address you see here. And this is basically what it means if you break it down, and I'll break down the back part of it really quickly, and that is what's left in the black bins, the trash bins. There are a few steps that need to be done. One is to look at what's in them so we know how to go to the top of the hierarchy with certain items that can't easily be recycled or composted. And then we need to mechanically remove additional recyclables. We call that material recovery. And then biologically stabilize them, anaerobically digest them, or aerobically compost them so that they're not going to be gassy and stinky in a landfill. You want to capture that gas if you can with the digestion process, so those organics are not breaking down in an open air environment where it's hard to capture. So this is just basically breaking down the three options. There's a landfill at the end of the system no matter what. Right? Direct landfilling is less bad than incineration and spreading the pollution around, but ultimately we need that back-end process to pre-process things and minimize small landfills that are not going to be gassy and sticky. And that's basically it.
Phil Bradley and you also, Mike, have mentioned about the toxic ash. I just wanted to let everyone know that Cleanaway actually have got plans to put their toxic ash residue into road base. So Phil Bradley, you're right in being concerned. They were actually saying that they plan to put it in road base, and they were trying to sort of like pull it up, just sort of say it like, well, you know, that's what they do everywhere around the world. And, you know, Antony and I both knew that they definitely don't do that, but they're trying to make out like that's the standard thing that they just put in the road base. And yeah, so I just want everyone to be aware of that.
I'm one of the knitting nanas, but most of my years of environmentalism, I've been most concerned about waste. So I'm a zero waste activist. And Peter Hopper here, who's listening in, has also been involved for many years. And I'm pretty sure he believes with me, that we really need strong zero waste legislation now. So it isn't just about waste, it's about environmental justice, marine and terrestrial justice. It's not just littering, but it's everything that we buy needs to be we have to make industry take responsibility for everything that they foist on us that cannot go back into the earth. So with zero waste legislation, we need tracked deposits and refunds, and we need industry to pay for the waste at end of life. And if you make industry pay for waste at end of life, they will think of the best solutions to design zero waste into their manufacturing process. And the people who buy things will have the incentive to send them back, and industry, when they have to pay for it to go to the tip, will have the incentive to design waste out of the process. If it is done in a staged manner, introducing different products, and using citizens' juries to help decide how to do it. When you have zero waste legislation and deposits and refunds, you get repair and reuse and refilling and retrofitting, relocalized jobs, with plenty of jobs with both professional and untrained workers, and it's localized, so you're employing people around every area. When you have incineration, just like Sweden, when they've reduced their waste, they have to keep feeding the beast. And it's interesting to see that the lifespan of an incinerator is only 22 years. So I think that zero waste legislation now is totally necessary, and it would be faster to bring that in than the 20 years that it takes for an incinerator to be put to bed.
The issue of incineration coming to New South Wales is part of a national agenda, and that's part of an international agenda also. So it's really important to understand the broader context behind what's going on, and that is really being driven by the federal government waste export ban, the decline in fossil fuels and the rise in petrochemicals, the policies that have been passed around in every state in Australia now, the zero waste to landfill policies, knowing full well if we don't have a landfill to put our waste in, where is it going to go? And in rides the incineration industry to the rescue. That's been happening across Australia. Some of the things that I think that can really help the campaign in New South Wales, one of the first things is to recognise that the industry is really relying on renewable energy subsidies and public funds to get up. And so in Australia, these projects are getting millions and millions of dollars of renewable energy money, and that's under the Renewable Energy Act. So one of the first things politicians can do is stop that, change the Renewable Energy Act so that renewable energy money and clean energy money doesn't go to incinerators, because they are certainly not renewable and they're certainly not clean. So the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA are funding these projects, multi-million-dollar, hundreds of thousands of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, sorry. Sydney is classified as a C40 city, and this is a classification that's given under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So Sydney wants to claim itself as a C40 city, and it's going to meet all these Sustainable Development Goals. So approving and building an incineration industry runs directly contrary to that goal. So it's really important, I think, to remind politicians and the Mayor of Sydney of their obligations under the C40 status that they've signed on to. One of the other things I think is really important to mention now is the recent Australian Public Health Association's international systemic review of the health impacts of incineration. That's a really important document that really is supportive of the campaign. It was a very conservative international systemic review, but that goes in our favour in Australia. So I want to mention the Australian Public Health, which concluded that regardless of the conservative nature of the study that they did conclude that incinerators cause public health impacts. This is indisputable. So that's a very strong public health, independent, international systemic review, because we do need a political solution to this at the end of the day. We need a ban or at least a moratorium on this industry, and we need a concerted, united political solution. We need a strong community to support them and force politics to do that. And that's how you'll win this campaign, because the solutions exist. You'll see them on our website. Zero waste city models are the solution. They're already operating all throughout Europe.
Come gather round, you people, and listen to this song.
We're singing of the beauty of the earth where we belong. We know the planet's warming, the ocean's rising too. Those fires rage, the cyclones rage. What are we to do? Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, girls? Which side are you on? It's time to stop, clean away, and their leader, Vic Bancel, making our air lethal. It's anything but clean. Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, girls? Which side are you on? Dioxins made in burning, hydrocarbons and chlorine, causing cancer clusters. It's anything but clean. Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, girls? Which side are you on? Yeah, we share in Sydney, keeps us all alive. Don't turn it into poison, help our kids survive. Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, girls? Which side are you on? Oh, which side are you on, boys? Which side